Welcome everyone back to the Real News Network. I'm Jared Ball here in Baltimore. Video of an exchange last week between Black Lives Matter activists and Hilary Clinton is currently making its viral rounds, causing some to see this as an advance of a movement in its ability to challenge power. But what precisely is the value of such actions, and what of the absence in that exchange of actual demands? To address these and related questions are Adam Jackson, CEO of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and Director of Public Policy for that same organization, Dayvon Love. Welcome to you both back to the Real News Network.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So Adam, let's start with you. As I've said in the introduction, I want to ask you both as seasoned activists, people doing on-the-ground work here in Baltimore on a regular basis, and those who have both been on some level involved in some working relationships with Black Lives Matter, what you think of this exchange as you've seen it between a couple of activists and Hilary Clinton?
Well, one of my more fundamental issues with Black Lives Matter generally, and it's kind of illustrated in the exchange, is that there's no focus on institution building. I mean, first off, Hilary Clinton meeting with some activists from Black Lives Matter means nothing in the long term. I mean, they're not making demands or anything specific in terms of an agenda that's going to be uplifting to Black folks as a whole. And besides that, she was schooling them on, you know, in terms of talking about changing the hearts and minds of white people. Hilary Clinton was the one talking about redistributing resources and demanding laws and accountability. So the thing is, what it comes across as me is that people are not focusing on nation building, the Black Lives Matter movement, and it needs to be a focus on how we can do that instead of changing hearts and minds and focusing on social media and, you know, Twitter posts. You know, people need to be focusing on how we're going to nation build and protect lives of Black people in the long term.
Dayvon, same question. Your initial response to that interaction?
Well, I mean, I was really disappointed. I think one of the things that emanates a lot through the conversations I hear from a lot of activists that proclaim to be, you know, formally or officially affiliated with Black Lives Matter, is really the lack of concrete policy proposals and demands, as well as a lack of emphasis on advancing particular, whether it's policies or things to just endorse that affect the material conditions of Black people. And so when we look at a lot of what we see, that exchange to me was more about, you know, wanting, you know, former Secretary Clinton to feel a different way, as opposed to putting forward concrete demands that could improve the quality of life for Black people.
You know, I mean, when I watched the exchange, it did feel, you know, on the one hand, we all, I think, want to support the general endeavors of Black Lives Matter, and I certainly wouldn't want this conversation to be placed in you know, just lumped in with all the others that are taking place that are just critical, sort of blanketly critical of Black Lives Matter. We want to, in some way, be supportive. But I was a bit concerned in seeing what seemed to be a walk back from what has been traditionally part of the Black liberation struggle, and positions that I think had long been achieved, most specifically, taking our concerns for the Black community here in the United States above and beyond even just domestic politics. You know, there's long histories of people like Du Bois or Malcolm X or others taking issues to the United Nations, or Marcus Garvey looking beyond even the shores of the entire Western Hemisphere for support for the Black struggle. And yet here it seemed to be something that was solely focused on getting a mainstream dominant white politician to speak about the hearts and minds of white people, and it felt like a walk back. I'm wondering if either of you have any sense of that. Dayvon, I'll start with you, or if there's any critique of of my analysis or interpretation of it that you would want to share.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think a part of the problem is that, you know, there's an industry around using Black people's bodies and Black people's ideas in a way that helps to reinforce the institutional power of white-dominated control institutions and intellectual projects in order to make sure that white folks are still in control, even on the left. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is that the exchange, I think, is representative of a paradigm as to how the left approaches issues facing Black people, which is more about consciousness raising and resisting power, as opposed to the activity of building power and putting forward agenda items concretely to address the issues that we face in our communities. So I want to echo your statement in terms of wanting to be generally supportive of people that are doing something as it relates to trying to address the condition of Black people, and that we would never want to discourage that spirit. But I think it's important that we understand that we operate in a context where there are certain interests in Black folks presenting themselves in the way that was presented in that particular exchange, where you have a Black person, explaining issues of racism and white supremacy and asking about, her change in feeling. That is something that plays into the strength of white supremacy, in the sense that that approach is about white acceptance and license on certain things, as opposed to organizing the power and putting demands at the table that can concretely address the issues Black people face.
So, Adam, I'd like you to respond to any of that as well, but also as a leader of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, were you and your organization to take a meeting such as that with Hilary Clinton or anyone else for that matter, what might be some of the agenda items that you would want to see addressed specifically?
Well, to respond to the second part of your question, I think that, first off, LBS and a bunch of other grassroots organizations here in Baltimore, we've already been doing some of the work in terms of reforming laws and working on the substantive agenda items that need to be addressed in terms of accountability in regards to police brutality and things like that. So if someone like Hilary Clinton, who has a lot of clout in the Democratic Party, and in Baltimore, where we're a heavily Democratic city, my demand would be that she put some of the other elected officials on the hook, and she put them in line with supporting an agenda that's going to transform the conditions of Black people. Because there's people already here doing the work. We don't really need Hilary Clinton to come into town and to give us anything or to create something. She just needs to throw her political support, her financial support, and that of her colleagues behind the agenda of the grassroots. And I think that's what was missing from that exchange with her, with the Black Lives Matter folks. And I also agree that we should be supportive, but I also think we should be wary of folks who are becoming new age poverty pimps when we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. You got people so instead of the Al Sharptons of the world who have a platform like major news media and talk about Black issues, now you have people who tweet and share Facebook posts, and people claim them as leaders of grassroots activism in major cities. And I think that people need to be politically astute enough to know the differences, and so they can identify how to gain and attain power, as opposed to just being people who are talking heads who have no connection to the communities that are affected by these issues. I think long term, that's what we need to throw our support behind, because I think that the energy is there, and we shouldn't discourage people's energy in terms of wanting to uplift the conditions of their people. But at the same time, we shouldn't encourage narcissism in the face of actual transformation of the conditions of our people.
Dayvon, one of the critiques I saw of that exchange suggested that one of the agenda items that might have been of value for Black Lives Matter to put before Hillary Clinton would be a decriminalization of protest. As we see in this country, increasingly, there is a problem with protest being criminalized and demonized. But I would ask you the same question. What other agenda items might LBS seek to specifically put on the table were you to take that kind of meeting with a Hillary Clinton or someone akin to that position?
A very fundamental thing we need to be talking about is reparations. And that's a word that scares people. But if we look at one of the problems that people of African descent have in this country, you think about the 246 years of chattel slavery, where white folks are able to accumulate the amount of wealth they're able to accumulate, which then gives them access to capital that allows them to perpetuate the future iterations of white supremacy as they manifested themselves during Jim Crow and now in what people call this post-civil rights era. So we need to be talking about how do we make concrete investments in the resources in the communities of African descended people, so that we can be able to begin to do for ourselves in a way that will allow us to address the issue of white supremacy. We should also talk about something else that I wanted to make very clear, that I think is really important, is a lot of the conversation around law enforcement has been around federal law. And one of the things that in LBS we are very clear about is that most of the law enforcement rules and regulations in this country operate on the state level. And so in Maryland, we have the Maryland Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, and we have a heavily Democratic General Assembly. And so one of the things that a Hillary Clinton could do is using her political capital as, a darling of the Democratic Party, to be able to use her political capital to influence the state legislature in the state of Maryland to amend the law enforcement or even repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which gives police officers certain protections against allowing the community to hold them accountable. And so being able to figure out, in the particular terrain that you're operating in, whether it's Baltimore City, whether it's Ferguson or wherever, what are the things that impede police accountability for us? That would be something that we would have asked, former Secretary Clinton to help to be supportive of, because that's something that we could concretely use to pass an important piece of legislation to affect police brutality here in the state of Maryland.
Very finally, I did want to ask the both of you if you thought that any of that, what I think we're all agreeing we saw as lacking in that exchange, could be related to the levels or the quality or the experience in actual organizational building. I heard you both mention institution building, but I also hear in part of that process is really firmly cementing an organization that would then have clear agenda items, have a clear protocol for who's going to speak for who and what's to be said in certain settings. Is there anything that you would want to encourage Black Lives Matter activists or anyone else looking to engage this struggle based on your long experience doing this work here in Baltimore?
I mean, probably my advice would be to stop getting swept up in the national media coverage and the sound of the national dialogue and focus on the grassroots building that you can do in the places that you live. Because I think here in Baltimore, one of the things that we've been real clear about in terms of how we're going to move forward is that we already have people doing stuff here. We already have organizations, and we already have individuals who are doing things, which is why we formed a coalition of them to kind of centralize resources and power. And so in terms of Black Lives Matter folks, I think that you need to identify organizations in the local communities, build power, build a base there, and then to kind of move from, creating an agenda that local politicians and local leaders have to follow, as opposed to national media dictating what your agenda should be for the places you're at. So, because in Baltimore, whatever they do, like Dayvon said earlier, whatever they do on the federal level most likely won't have an effect on Baltimore. Most of the money for public safety comes from the state and local level in terms of our police department, and we're talking about police accountability. So we need to be focused on state and local law. Federal law really doesn't have an impact on what we do here in Baltimore. And so it's all about the local grassroots building and the financial resources you can centralize and finding other organizations you can partner with locally, as opposed to focusing on the national folks.
Dayvon?
I mean, just to reiterate, a little bit of what Adam mentioned, just the idea of having organizations to hold people accountable. And I really encourage people to not think of activism as an individual endeavor that you want to engage in for the purpose of, being your own, being a hero or trying to save, other people. But I think it's important to build organization and build organization that holds people accountable. So we can begin to build sustainable long-term movement building that can last beyond just a moment.
And if I could just quickly suggest to anybody that gets themselves in front of somebody like Hilary Clinton, please put in a word for the abolishment of all debt, cancellation of debt, student and otherwise. I think that would be a great platform plank for anybody to build an effort or movement off of. Thank you both for joining us here at The Real News. Dayvon Love, Adam Jackson of Leaders of Beautiful Struggle. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here at The Real News. For all involved, again, I'm Jared Ball here in Baltimore. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind.